speaker today, Mr. Mark Bruzonsky, will try to provide some answers to these and other questions for us. Mr. Bruzonsky has made over 150 trips to the Middle East. He holds degrees from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs at Princeton University, the New York University School of Law. He's been a consultant on the Middle East for organizations like Congressional Quarterly, the National Geographic Society, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at the Smithsonian Institution. His books include Security in the Middle East, Regional Change and Great Power Strategies, and The Middle East, U.S. Policy, Israel, Oil, and the Arabs. He has been a consultant for a series of educational film strips, The Middle East, produced by the National Geographic Society. He was recently featured in the CD book Lines in the Sand. His articles have appeared in many of the leading newspapers in the United States, including the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, and Los Angeles Times. His work has also appeared in many of the leading opinion outlets in Europe and the Middle East. Mr. Bruzonsky provided the live commentary for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation during the 1993 Rabin Arafat ceremony at the White House. He currently hosts a half-an-hour television program, Middle East Realities, that appears around the nation on cable television outlets. Mr. Bruzonsky is the chairperson and founder of the Jewish Committee on the Middle East, an organization of independent Jews in America. The Jewish Committee on the Middle East has supported the Palestinian Intifada since it began, has allocated a fully sovereign Palestinian state with a capital in Jerusalem, and called for major changes in U.S. policy towards the region. It is my pleasure to welcome to Bethany Mr. Mark Bruzonsky.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming. You know, I went to Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is very similar to your university, so it's a bit nostalgic for me. I have two other formal speeches today, one at lunch and one at dinner. And I could, lecture you, but I have a feeling that if I speak for a few minutes, tell you a bit about my background, my involvement with the Middle East, why I've stayed involved with it, and what I think about what's happening at the moment, we'll probably enjoy ourselves more, and I'll learn something from you if we just talk about it. You hopefully got questions, and I have answers. You may not necessarily like them or agree with them, but I assure you, since I've been asked a lot of questions, I have thought these things through for some time now. Like you, I went to college at a small school. I had never been to the Middle East. I'm Jewish. I grew up believing a lot of things that most Americans still believe. And then lightning struck. I got a fellowship to go to NYU Law School. I went to NYU. I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be involved in international affairs. I got a lucky break. I became the international student movement for the UN representative at UN headquarters in New York, and lo and behold, 3 years later, I'd been to 35 countries. My friends were from all over the world. For the first time, I went to Israel. For the first time in 1971, I went to Egypt, and I was scared out of my mind. It wasn't the Egypt of today. It was the Egypt of the Soviet Union. It was the Egypt of revolution. It was the Egypt of war with Israel. I was Jewish. For the first time in my life, I pretended I was Unitarian. I got a second passport, so there were no stamps. And from the moment I arrived, I realized something is terribly wrong. Within 24 hours, my whole world was collapsing. This wasn't the Egypt and the Arabs that I had been told all my life by my family, by my newspapers, by my friends. This was a country of great warmth. The people were extremely cordial. There was a huge civilization and history, and in 25 years now, I've gone back very often and gotten very involved with the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And of course, it's only recent years that America has gotten involved deeply with the Middle East. The American government, the CIA, the oil companies, they were involved with the Middle East. But I believe there was a study, and Saudi Arabia was never even mentioned in the congressional record until 1971. Things like the Intifada, like Eid al-Fitr, like Muslim holidays and Muslim celebrations were not talked about in this country in the 60s and 70s. So anyway, here we are in the 90s. We've just had war in the Middle East. Every day we're told there's a peace process. But if I were giving the lecture I gave at lunchtime, It's quite a peace process. Millions of people have been killed since the peace process started at Camp David. I met President Sadat in 1977. I arranged with him to send the first public telegram to Israel. He then went himself a week later. But none of us expected that what was talked about at the time would result in what happened. Within a short time of Camp David, you had revolution in Lebanon. You had revolution in Iran. You had trouble all the way from Algeria. I'm just skipping to the whole 20-year period. You've got revolution now from Algeria through Sudan, all the way through the Gulf. Today, as we speak, I don't know if it's finally hit the news, but the faxes I received before I left Washington is that there's near revolution and panic in Bahrain. And it's going to be blamed on the Iranians because the Bahrainis, like the Kuwaitis before them, want to find some excuse for the American army to come and save them from their own people. So in order to do that, you have to concoct some rationale for why we're doing it. You can't say the Bahraini people want to throw the bombs out. You've got to say it's being fomented by Iran. To my knowledge, this isn't even in the American newspapers. Now, my suspicion, since I was at Lawrence about 4 or 5 years ago, talking to a similar group of students, and I asked, who's been to the Middle East? Who's been to the Middle East among the students here? You have. And where are you from?
India.
And where have you been in the Middle East?
Bali, Saudi, Dubai.
All right. But as I suspected, very few, and none of the Americans have been there. And that's partly because things have changed in this country. In the 60s and 70s, students had a lot of freedom. There were student fairs, things were cheap, there were all kinds of ways in which young people went to Europe and went traveling in Africa. It doesn't happen anymore because our society has gotten much more difficult. Tuitions, I suspect, are expensive here. People have to work during the summer months. And it's a shame because what that means is your information and knowledge has to be based on what the media is willing to provide you, as well as what your professors can provide you. And on the whole, it's pretty inadequate in this country. So I assume what you're interested in, correct me if I'm wrong, and please, let's just have a discussion. If I'm wrong about something, just tell me. I assume you're most interested in the Arab-Israeli situation, the peace process, the terrorism, Yasser Arafat, and things of this kind. I see a few heads shaking yes, but okay, a few more heads shaking yes. Well, the peace process that they tell you so much about is, in my view, nothing more than the continuation of long-time Israeli and American policies. They've been repackaged. It's like soap. It's the same soap in the wrapper. It's just been repackaged to say nice things on the cover so that you'll buy it and believe it. The peace process has created more harm for the Palestinians than good. They're in worse shape now than they were before it started. They're being put on reservations in the name of peace, with terms like separation and terms like autonomy, but these terms are fed to you as a means of sanitizing and legitimizing policies that, if they were correctly told to you, you wouldn't find very attractive. So it used to be that peace was going to result in two states, equal dignity for Palestinians and Israelis, economic arrangements that were equitable. But now, the peace process they want us to believe in is a peace process where the Israelis dominate, where George Bush used to call it the New World Order, and I would call it the New World Domination. The purpose is to control the oil and the resources of the Middle East, so that Americans can have an artificially inflated standard of living. The overall purpose, which has nothing to do with Israel, is to pump as much cheap oil as possible but through American oil companies, to sell that oil as cheaply as possible to the American public, so that we can ride around in our cars and so that our industries can be artificially inflated with cheap energy. Then the secondary process is the only way we can do that is if we keep repressive monarchs and dictators and thugs in power. Chomsky calls them client regimes, and that's probably the best term. So the deal is, you know, you want to make a joke out of it, call it sort of a mafia-type deal. We keep repressive thugs and dictators in power. They call themselves royal families, kings, and queens. In return, they let us take the resources of the region, and we pay them a lot of money. Little of that money goes to the people who live in these countries. It's used by the royal families, it's squandered by the royal families, it's put in Swiss bank accounts by the royal families, and then when our industries, our arms industries and our military are in need, we tell the kings and queens it's time for you to buy another generation of airplanes, another generation of tanks. So we then take the petrodollars back. The petrodollars aren't used by the people of the Middle East. Petrodollars are sent back to our banks and our institutions. And then, in order to keep this scam going, we perpetually have to have conflict. So the Iranians had a revolution after 20 years of Americans keeping the Shah on the throne, and the first thing the Americans did was say, my God, we can't let this happen. My God, there might be a revolution in Saudi Arabia, or Kuwait, or Bahrain, or Egypt. So the Americans encouraged the Iraqis to attack Iran. And for the next 8 or 9 years, I'm not exaggerating, millions of people died in order to keep the region divided from itself, keep it firmly in the American and Western grip. And then we wonder why Americans are thought of as the great Satan, which is just a slogan. And we wonder why American hostages are taken, and we wonder why American journalists are treated like CIA agents, and we wonder why American tourists are now told to be careful and not go out at night or not go into the old city. I met people today who have recently been to Jerusalem on Christian pilgrimage, and they never even went to the Dome of the Rock because they couldn't walk through safely the old city of Jerusalem after a generation of Israeli occupation of the place. And then, of course, the World Trade Tower blows up, and we're told that we have to be frisked at our airports, and your own professor is treated as if he's off on some mission impossible. It's a very sad situation, and it's growing more tragic. And so why should we be concerned? I mean, you're at Bethany College, and you're not going to make 150 trips to the Middle East, and most of you may only go on a pilgrimage if you're lucky. So why bother? Why be concerned? Well, you know, there are basic issues of morality and justice involved. There are basic issues of what's right and what's wrong. There's basic issues of oppression, basic issues of torture and human rights. But it's even bigger than that. We're creating a schism now between the Islamic national world, which is the bulk of the population of these countries. The bulk of the population of these countries is not Western educated, is not secular. The bulk lives in poverty. The bulk are Muslim. The bulk are nationalist. And in just about every country, if they were free to say so, which they are not, they would prefer to have a benevolent Islamic government than to have the corrupt military and secular governments that currently rule them. But of course, none of them are free to say this. So you're not going to find this discussion in a coffee shop in Damascus or in Amman, because if you do, you will go home to your hotel and they will be taken in by the muhabarat, which all countries have muhabarats, and now the Palestinians have muhabarat. They're all funded by the CIA. And they're all now funded by the Americans in one way or the other, with some European support and some British support. And I know this is not what you hear on your TV, and some of you may think, you know, where's this guy coming from? And well, if you're an intellectual and you can write and you can come and talk and you can occasionally go on TV, you have an outlet, you have a release. You're not totally powerless. You have some way of expressing yourself, and Marilyn says, but you're taking risks. Well, you know, we're all taking risks. Driving here, you know, in the winter is probably taking a risk. But what if you're a Palestinian living in a refugee camp, and you've lived there all your life under Israeli occupation, and every night when you go to sleep, you're afraid the Israeli soldiers will come and they will beat your mother and father, or they will take your brother away and torture him, or they will blow up your house because a third relative, a third cousin of yours was implicated in some incident somewhere, and you grow up all your life like that. You are unable to even go 15 minutes up the road from Dheisheh camp to Jerusalem, because you have to carry a pass, and the Israelis won't let you go through the roadblocks with your pass. So those people are helpless, they're desperate, they see what's happening to them, they're being put on reservations. I mean, that's the easiest way to sum it up. And the maps are even available to anybody who wants to see the maps. Here's the agreement that your president, he's my president too, but somehow I'm having a hard time these days using that language. Here's the agreement that our president, Bill Clinton, alias president elected with the help of the Israeli Jewish lobby, tells you is a fair and honorable and just peace. All right, this is the West Bank. This is the area Israel occupied after after 1967. All the blue area is totally Israeli controlled.
Are Israeli defense forces actually in those blue areas at this present moment?
Blue area, no Palestinians, totally controlled by the Israelis.
Israeli defense forces are still occupying this area.
Yeah. And they're not leaving. They're spending millions of dollars on bypass roads and reinforcing the settlements. The white areas, now don't think the white areas are the Palestinian areas. White areas, which in themselves look like reservations and Bantustans, that's what is jointly administered by the Israelis and the Palestinian police. The Israelis don't call it the Palestine National Authority, the Israelis call it the Palestine Authority. The Israelis don't recognize any national rights for Palestinians. So those white areas are not what the Palestinians get. The Palestinians get the dark black areas on this map. Now, if the term reservations didn't mean anything to you, what else is this? When you have areas like this in which Palestinians live and have to have cards, magnetized cards, computerized cards, to even, not just to travel abroad. A Palestinian who wants to go from here to here has to go through Israeli checkpoints, have Israeli permission. And literally as we speak, yes, there's been terrorism in Israel, and we can discuss what kind and why and whether it's justified or not. But isn't it also terrorism when a woman who's pregnant drives from her village and gets to an Israeli roadblock, and the Israelis say, sorry, go back, and her babies die or she dies waiting in a taxi to go to the hospital? You know, what are we supposed to call this? And I could pull out of my bag stuff from the internet, people pleading for their families, people saying that my father needs dialysis and he's stuck in Jenin and he's going to die, there's no dialysis machines and the Israelis won't let him through. Well, the reason for this is you apply collective punishment. You beat the people into submission. If somebody rises up, if somebody fights back, you punish everyone. You blow up their homes, you lock them behind barriers, you tell them they can't go out, they can't go to hospital. Well, there's two purposes. One is collective punishment, to force a huge price to be paid. The other is, basically, the Israelis want them to leave. They want the old people to grow old and die, and they want the young people to get out because there's no life for them there, there's no future for them there. And in fact, many of them leave. But since the Palestinians have a huge birth rate, there's still a lot of them there. So this is the peace process perpetrated by the United States of America in the name of democracy and justice. But of course it's totally hypocritical, and everybody in the Middle East knows that it's totally hypocritical. It's just that there aren't any newspapers or TV stations in the Middle East to talk about it, because they're all controlled by the client regimes that I talked about before. So I'll just give you two little stories, and then I'll shut up. I can remember being in Cairo about 7-8 years ago, meeting an MIT graduate, spoke English perfectly, setting up a computer business, very nice guy, got along just fine. I have a sideline in computers. We had a lot to talk about. We get to know each other for a few weeks, and one day he asked me, would you like to have a drink tonight? We go over to the Old Shepherd Hotel. He goes up, he gets 2 beers from the bar, he sits down, he looks me in the eye, and he says, all right, I've gotten to know you a bit. Can we talk about something other than computers and business tonight? And I said, you know, I've been waiting. And he just looks at me and says, do you know how much we Egyptians hate you Americans? I knew he didn't mean me. I knew what he meant. But you won't get that in your 2-day visit to the pyramids, and you won't get that hanging around the hotel, the Hilton Hotel. You'll only get that if you have real relationships there. And he wanted to let me know that, you know, things are real bad here, that we're forced to hate the Americans because we know what the Americans are doing to us. And another example, the reason I came back and set up the Jewish Committee on the Middle East in the early months of the Palestinian Intifada, the uprising, I met an adorable little girl. I was traveling on a Pan Am World Pass. The world changes. If you're a little older, you forget Pan Am used to be the big airline. And you could earn an award. You could earn a 30-day credit card pass that allowed you to just go to the airport and for 30 days travel anywhere in the world. So sure enough, I earned it. And then they announced that if you don't use it by a certain month, they're going to cancel it. So December 1987 was the last month. So sure enough, I'm going everywhere. That happened to be the month the Palestinian Intifada broke out. So I was free to go to the airport and just go. And I had promised myself I wouldn't. I'd go everywhere other than the Middle East because I'd earned the award going to the Middle East. But with the Intifada breaking out, I said, look, I'm going. I want to go to a refugee camp. I'm going to stay there for 2, 3, 4 days. I'll come right back. I just want to see for myself. I went. I signed in to the refugee camp. I'd been to refugee camps plenty of times for coffee, for discussion, for political exchange. I'd never been there to stay. What a difference. I was shocked. For the first day, I was waiting for them to announce lunch or dinner. I didn't realize till the second day that the pastries that came around in the afternoon and the things they handed out during the day, that was lunch or dinner. There are no meals. Finally, by the second day, they threw a feast. An old man who was telling me the stories of 1947 and I got to sit in a room with his whole family, and they managed to find a few pieces of chicken and a few pieces of bread and za'atar. And as the evening went on, I realized he and I were the only ones who were eating. It's because there wasn't anything for anybody else. This was the best they could do. And the last night before I left to come back, I had to go to Bethlehem because there were no taxis from the refugee camp. And I met this adorable little Palestinian girl. She was cute as could be. And she loved that I was there. I had my video camera, and she was told I was from America, and she was singing and dancing and smiling, and she's having the time of her life. Her name was Lena. And then, maybe 45 minutes into the evening, her father calls her over, and it was being translated for me, and he says to Lena, now Lena, I want you to know Mark is from America, and you know Mark is a journalist, but Mark is also Jewish. Lena stops in her tracks, looks around, maybe like a computer searching for this word, you know, Jewish, good, family, house. And she finally decides the only thing that this could be is it's got to be a joke. Since it can't be true, it has to be a joke. So she starts laughing and says, you're joking with me, he's not Jewish, of course he's not Jewish. And then her father explains to her that, oh, no, Mark's Jewish. You have to understand, Lena, that there are good Jews and bad Jews. You have to understand that sometimes a Jewish person can be a friend. The poor girl tries to understand this concept. She's 3 years old. And she can't. She literally cannot understand the concept that there can be such a thing as a good Jew. So she thinks about it a little more, and then she decides, oh my God, it's true. There's a Jew in our house. She didn't care anymore that I was a friend of the father. She didn't care about anything she'd been told, this little 3-year-old. She comes up, she starts hitting me. She starts ordering the camera to be turned off, and she's not going to cooperate with this guy. He's Jewish. She orders me out of her house. I'm supposed to leave. And for the next day, until I left the next morning, she's staring at me as if I'm from Mars, you know, I'm some... And that's the world that we're creating. We're creating a world of suspicion and a world of hate in which children, from the beginning of their lives, don't understand that people are different, that people are good and bad on all sides of the line. Their only experience is soldiers and hate and repression. And I'm not